I'm Tolulokpe Adelaru Balogun. This is our headline story for today. Effect of Kenya's digital tax. Now, Kenya's new income tax, the Digital Service Tax Regulations 2020, came into force on January the 2nd, 2021, after being gazetted. This new tax will apply to such digital services as downloadable digital content, including mobile applications, e-books, and even films. Now, the effect is already being felt. From April, all Google downloads from Google Play Store will attract a 16% value-added tax charge. However, Kenya is not the first African country to aim taxation at digital products. What is the effect of this going to be? That is our focus today. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Google has said that it will start adding a 16% value-added tax for Google Play purchases in Kenya. This takes effect from the 8th of April 2021. This charge follows the introduction of the digital tax law in Kenya, which came into effect in January 2021. Google will automatically collect the tax and remit 16% VAT for Play Store paid applications and in-app purchases to the Kenya Revenue Authority. Analysts have argued that the digital tax will make mobile applications and in-app purchases more expensive. The digital tax will apply to Kenyans both in the country and in the diaspora. The tech giants will also begin using VAT-inclusive pricing in Kenya, which means that prices shown on Google Play will include all taxes regardless of where your business is located. Other local and global digital service providers will also follow suit or risk losing their business licenses in Kenya. Other digital utilities, such as tax hailing and e-commerce platforms, will soon follow what the U.S. firm has done. Joining me from Lusaka, Zambia, is Mtwalo Umsoni. He's a researcher and economist, and he's going to take us through this as we break down what is yet another digital tax on the continent. Mtwalo, thank you once again for joining me. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Good morning to you too.
All right. Let's take a quick trip down memory lane. So in 2014, South Africa implemented a 14% value-added tax on digital imports. This was the first African country to do so. In May 2018, the Ugandan government passed a law imposing a daily levy of 200 shillings on users of over-the-top online services, including Facebook and WhatsApp. The Zambian government announced a daily tariff of about 0.03, that's just about 3 cents, on internet phone calls in August of 2018. Tanzania is slightly different. Now, in March of 2018, Tanzanians woke up to a law requiring online content creators to pay a licensing fee. They're to pay an application fee, an initial registration fee, and an annual registration fee. The government will tell you that this is about increasing revenues. What do you think this is about?
Well, it is about increasing revenues, and it's a basic response to the changing trends in the way business is done. You can't run away from the fact that the digital economy is here to stay. There are increasing number of businesses that are done online, and this has even increased more during the pandemic period. More and more goods and services are being purchased using internet platforms. Most people are shifting their adverts from a TV station like Central News Africa to digital platforms. So eventually, something needed to be done about taxing the digital economy, and this has been part of the global debate. The OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Inclusive Framework has been seeking to develop a global consensus on taxing the digital economy, on how different countries can tap into the profitability and the revenues that are being earned by these digital platforms. A study in 2020 estimated that $245 billion is being lost to tax avoidance and tax abuses. This is a huge figure, and some of it is being attributed to the digital economy. A study in the EU shows that the effective tax rate for the digital businesses, Facebook, Google, is about 9.5%. This is in contrast to traditional businesses that are taxed about 23.2%. So unilateral measures have been introduced in a number of countries, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and regulations are following. So what the Kenyan government is doing right now is basically also introducing its form of unilateral measures and ensuring that companies also adhere to some of the tax rules. The current global tax rules are not fit for purpose. Back then, it was okay to have rules that refer to you as a taxpayer only if you had a presence in country, a permanent establishment, you had an office in country, if you had a taxpayer identification number. But what we are seeing with these digital businesses is you can access online platforms even if the platform is not available in your country. They benefit from our user content. Our own content is where they make revenues from. And you can actually be in the business of selling and buying without actually having a presence in country. So ultimately, we are supposed to benefit from these revenues. And I think this is just part of the unilateral measures that have been introduced in Kenya. The digital service tax is the 1.5 on the gross turnover of revenues by the companies, and in coupled to that, there's also a VAT, but we do know that VAT falls on the consumer ultimately.
Okay, so I'm struggling a bit because when I also have this conversation on the social media and the digital rights aspect of it, there are those who are really lambasting African governments for what they see as an encroachment into this space and what they're seeing as an attempt to restrict. In some terms, we heard that the Ugandan president said restricting idle talk, but that's an aspect of the conversation that's outside of the business aspect of it. So, Mtwalo, one thing I find interesting about this Kenyan law is that they are going to apply this digital tax to Kenyans in the country and Kenyans outside of the country. Please tell me, how does this work, given the fact that Kenyans outside the country are possibly paying this form of digital tax wherever they may be? They're paying other taxes where they are. So how will this aspect of the law work?
Well, for the VAT, I'm sure it will be, as Google announced, it will be passed on to the consumer. So if you're consuming a good and you're using a Kenyan IP address, if it's been shipped to a Kenyan address, for instance, or it's a Kenyan who's accessing a service, be it advertising, be it purchasing of different goods and services, then it basically means if you're paying for a Gmail account, there'll be a 16% on top of what you used to pay, which will go to government in form of revenue. So the target here is Kenyans who are accessing this and accessing it from Kenya ideally. But if you have Kenyan details that you're going to share on accessing this, then naturally the system dictates that you actually pay this form of tax to Kenya. There are two different things that we need to bear in mind. So first, there's a value-added tax, which Facebook also made an announcement today will be effective from 1st April. The value-added tax is 16%.
Yeah.
There's also a digital service tax, which is 1.5% on the gross turnover in terms of revenues from all the sales of goods and services between business to business and business to customers, where one of the parties is resident in Kenya. It's important to note that these taxes are not necessarily progressive form and do not necessarily deal with the problems that are there with tax in the digital economy, which ultimately is trying to benefit from some of the profits that are being made by these very profitable companies that are using models of which our current tax systems are not fit for purpose and can benefit from not having a permanent establishment and go out with making lots of money in country. The base of the taxes that have been imposed are currently on revenues, VAT being a consumption tax, and the digital service tax just being on the revenues that are have been accumulated by the different companies. For Kenya, there are no thresholds that have been put in place, which is in contrast to most countries that have a form of digital service tax, where they look at having thresholds so as not to impose a huge tax burden on small businesses that are probably starting off and are not necessarily profitable. And I think this is where the problem of sanctions and the US having problems with some nations that have been trying to impose unilateral measures like India have come from.
Okay, so we'll get into the U.S.-Kenya relations and how this might affect that. You mentioned the OECD as well. We'll also get into that as well. But in terms of this, for avoidance of doubt, what makes what makes a digital service taxable? So if Kenya's government, the Kenya Revenue Agency, is looking at my phone now, I'm in Kenya, just for the avoidance of doubts and for clarification, what activities that I do in the digital space would be taxable in Kenya?
If you purchase something, that would be taxable. If you sell something, that would be taxable. So this is inclusive of adverts, applications, other forms of digital services. If you're paying for your Gmail account, as long as you do it from Kenyan sort of IP address, that will be liable to tax. The person who will pay that tax, first of all, is the person who's getting the revenue. So if you have an eBay account and revenues are coming to you, that would be taxable. You are accessing a service that allows you to probably rent out your property online, that will be taxable. If you're purchasing a good from Google, you're purchasing adverts from Google, you're purchasing adverts from Facebook, that will attract both VAT and will also ideally need to attract 1.5 on revenues from the service providers who are paid directly to the Kenyan government.
Okay, so as I was reading up on this, there are those that believe that digital services payments to countries that have income tax treaties with Kenya may not be subject to the digital services tax, given the reliance on the concepts of residency and permanent establishment as a basis for determining the jurisdiction with the taxing rights. Now, you've mentioned this earlier in terms of how the OECD is looking for guidelines and frameworks, and even they acknowledge that the current taxation system, over 100 years old, is no longer fit for purpose. But when it comes to this issue of the income tax treaties, residency, the permanent establishments, what's your understanding of this situation as it relates to the digital service tax?
Most income tax treaties were also entered into before we knew that business models would change, digital presence would be as it is now. They're equally not fit for purpose, and there's need to revise the income tax treaties, the treaties that are entered into between different nations. The idea for that was to avoid double taxation or double non-taxation. But as it is, it would work against countries as we seek to tax the digital economy, because some of the provisions in the treaties might not give taxing rights to a country like Kenya, even if it imposes such taxes. I think this speaks to the need to have a global consensus, global solution towards taxing the digital economy. But unfortunately, the OECD process seems to have failed, and the current proposals, which are currently watered down, seem not to favor developing countries like Kenya and other countries within the African continent, simply because the process from the start has not been as inclusive enough. It's called the Inclusive BEPS framework, but it hasn't been inclusive enough. And I don't think the OECD themselves are fit for purpose to be leading on a process to develop a global solution of taxing the digital economy, when they have been beneficiaries from some of the revenues that have been lost to African countries through tax avoidance and base erosion and profit shifting. Ideally, I think we should have a UN tax body which is looking at aspects of taxing the digital economy and having global solutions to not only taxing the digital economy, but dealing with base erosion and profit shifting. Unfortunately, the global solution, the global consensus was supposed to be reached last year by the OECD. There was no agreement. We've been told that by mid this year, there will be a solution. But if there's no solution, we'll continue seeing increasing number of unilateral measures. There are basically lots of unilateral measures that have been picked out by some countries. Some countries can also try to implement formulary apportionment or formulary alternative minimum tax, which tries to use a form of formula to calculate the taxes that are liable to a country from the profits that are being made by the big
firms,
digital businesses, say Google, say Facebook. So multiply that by the number of users that are in country, the revenue that was earned, the value in terms of user content that was there. If they have some form of office, you calculate the number of staff and so on. You index that and you get the tax that is paid, that can be paid and attributed to specific countries.
Okay, this is absolutely fascinating because across the world, we are seeing countries, I won't say take aim at tech companies, but trying to really see what is accruable to them and also looking at some of their legal responsibilities in country as well. And Twalo, just hold on. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get a bit more into that OECD conversation around taxation globally, especially for the digital space. Then we'll also take a look at Uganda. A digital tax was put in Uganda, and it did not play out the way the Ugandan government expected. Should we expect that this might be the situation in Kenya as well? This is Business Edge. Do stay with us. So let's quickly talk about punishments for the tech companies that fail to comply with the new digital tax. So we know at the worst end of it is that they lose their right or their license to be able to operate in Kenya. But before you get there, what are some of the, I guess, milestones along the way when it comes to punishment or fines if these tech companies don't fall in line?
The problem with the digital economy is because of the business model that they're using. I think it's an incentive for tax avoidance. Like you had said, there's an incentive for digital economies to try to go treaty shopping, try to shop where Kenya has a treaty and have an establishment there, because they do know if there's a treaty in place, taxing rights for Kenya will be restricted. In terms of the worst that can happen, like you had said, we do know that countries can block digital services, providing digital services in a specific country. That can be overridden easily by changing the IP address. We've seen this case where internet shutdown has been there in some countries, or some websites are blocked in some countries, and you can simply override that by changing some IP address, proxy information, and so on and so forth. But I think the biggest thing that's there is to ensure compliance, with the incentive to say, if you comply with this, you can continue to operate within our country and your presence will be grown, it won't be legal. And we do know these digital businesses do make lots of money from operating in the different nations, and they need to comply. Non-compliance will also lead to penalties as suggested by the law and the regulations that have followed the law.
Okay.
Compliance has been made easy for the VAT, basically because it will be withheld by the tech companies like Google and Facebook, and be remitted by the government and not by the individual taxpayer.
Okay, so let's look at how something similar played out in Uganda. Just bear with me. So according to the Uganda Communications Commission, in the 3 months following the introduction of their digital levy in 2019, the number of internet subscriptions to such services fell by more than 2.5 million. Later, the government finally admitted that the tax did not actually generate the revenue that it was anticipating. Instead, technology and financial sectors were hit hard. The number of people paying the tax for sites listed as over the top, chosen by the government because they offer voice and messaging services, fell by 1.2 million. The value of mobile money transactions also fell by almost a quarter to 14.8 trillion Ugandan shillings between June and September of the year the tax was introduced. So let me say, maybe Uganda is different. But what do you think the research shows when these types of taxes are introduced? Do they really ultimately generate the level of revenue that the governments want, or do they, at the end of the day, do much more harm to the industries and the sectors that are dependent on digital products?
Well, it basically teaches us that if you're going to impose a tax on consumption, it reduces the consumption on the
Yes.
basic good and service. It's a basic wrong targeting of a tax. So instead of having the tax implemented where the burden falls on the consumer, like a value-added tax, ideally, the burden is supposed to fall on the big tech service providers. This is why we see when digital service taxes are introduced in Europe, there are lower thresholds and upper thresholds on the amount of revenue that needs to have been generated by these companies for them to be liable for a tax. This has been seen to be targeting the big US digital companies, but in essence, this actually cautions and provides a caution to say it does not affect the consumption of the different digital services, as people are not paying more for the services, but rather companies that are profiting for this are meant to pay. A good example of a tax, a unilateral measure tax that can address something like this, is the fractional apportionment in India, which approximates the revenues that would be attributed to India by looking at the profitability margin and multiplying by the revenue that has been generated, indexing that with the number of users, with the infrastructure in country, and so many other parameters, and you can be able to get the tax from the big tech and not only on the consumer, because we do know that these taxes are mostly regressive.
All right. So you said at the end of the day, you are taxing consumption, but these type of taxes then end up reducing that same consumption. So the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development has actually warned against implementing this new tax and has warned against these type of taxes. But as you noted earlier, the Organization for Economic Cooperation, OECD, has been trying to work on the development of a digital tax global guideline framework. So is there a balance that can be found in your estimation? Is there a balance to taxing activities and business online, a balance that doesn't then still kill these businesses but does raise something? Or are we looking at governments that are expecting too much revenue to come from this area?
The argument by UNCTAD and by the World Trade Organization has been that there are currently global rules that look at not inhibiting trade through taxes, tariffs, excise duties. So ideally, the challenge with tax in the digital economy has always been the fact that these platforms are benefiting from user information. They sell my information to advertisers. They make money off the information that I give to them by signing on to the policy agreement. They make so much money in my countries. They're replacing traditional businesses. So if I wanted to advertise, I would go to a TV station, advertise, I would go to radio. Now I would go to a digital platform, and unfortunately, my country is not benefiting from these revenues as they would benefit from a traditional TV station that would pay their corporate income tax, as they would benefit from a traditional radio station. So it has been to a large extent about the profitability of the companies. I made mention that the effective tax rate has been said to be 7.5% compared to 23.3% for traditional businesses.
All right.
Unfortunately, what we can do in terms of unilateral measures is to impose the tax on revenues regardless of whether they're profitable or not. But generally, the global consensus should be around profits, and this would deal with the concerns of the World Trade Organizations and UNCTAD.
Mthwalo, I have to stop you here, but I think this is such a fascinating conversation and one that we need to keep our eyes on as we see more African countries. So we have South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania. Now we're talking about Kenya, Nigeria, Angola. We're seeing this wave of digital taxation sort of sweep across the continent since around 2014 it is. And we need to keep an eye on how it plays out for the economies and particularly for the informal sector in countries that have unemployment, high youth unemployment issues. Mthwalo Msoni, as always, it's a pleasure. We'll have this conversation, part 2 of it, as we continue seeing how things develop in Kenya. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Pleasure is all mine.
All right. And as we wrap things up, we speed through NC4 to watch, and we start in Uganda, where the country has announced that the signing of the East African crude oil pipeline deal and the launch of other projects has been deferred to next month following the death of Tanzanian President John Magufuli. Now, before his death, he had been scheduled to travel to Kampala for the tripartite signing of the pipeline deal between the governments of Uganda and Tanzania and the lead investor Total as well. Moving on from there, economic research company Capital Economics in a new report says tourism sectors in Africa, like other parts of the world, have been hit particularly hard by the coronavirus pandemic. The report notes that these sectors will be among the slowest to recover from the pandemic, inflicting further economic pain on countries dependent on the industry. The Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation Group General Manager Mila Kyari disclosed that the federal government subsidizes PMS to the tune of about 120 billion naira monthly. That's about $263.25 million. He now says the NNPC can no longer afford to bear the cost, saying Nigerians would have to pay the actual cost sooner or later, as market forces must be allowed to determine the pump price of petrol in the country. And finally, the United Nations World Food Programme in Egypt obtained in 2020 a financial contribution of 15 million euros from the Egyptian-German debt swap program to help the government meet the food and educational needs of some families. A year after implementation, it seems that there are tangible results. That's all on Business Edge for today. If you missed any of our conversations this week, do head to our website and to YouTube to catch up. Follow us on social media so you never miss out on African business and financial conversations. I'm Tolulope Adileru Balogun. Bye for now.